For 13 years, Claire Whitcomb told everybody in Cedar Ridge that my trees were an eyesore. And for 13 years, I let her talk. She said those old green walls made the neighborhood look like a campground. She said I was ruining property values. She even joked at a town meeting that I was one flannel shirt away from charging admission to a squirrel museum. Then, on the coldest Tuesday night our county had seen in 40 years, Claire showed up at my cattle gate with frozen mascara on her cheeks, one designer boot missing a heel, and asked me if I had any coffee left. My name is Bennett Hale, though most folks around Murray County call me Ben, and my family has worked the same stretch of red dirt outside Willow Creek, Missouri, since my great-grandfather bought it in 1931 with a borrowed mule, a cracked plow, and the kind of optimism only poor people and farmers can afford. We grow hardwood seedlings, fence-row cedar, a few acres of Christmas firs, and just enough hay to keep the place honest. I'm 69 now, retired from teaching forestry at the State College, but I still get up before sunrise because trees do not care if your knees hurt, and frankly, neither do goats. My wife, June, says I have two speeds, slow and stubborn, and she is not wrong. I have worn the same canvas jacket since the first Bush administration. I drive a 1998 Dodge Ram that sounds like a coffee can full of bolts, and I own exactly one suit, which I wore to my daughter's wedding, my mother's funeral, and one zoning hearing where a man in loafers tried to explain soil conservation to me. That man was not Claire Whitcomb, but he might as well have been her warm-up act. Claire moved into the neighborhood west at my farm in 2012, after her husband, Grant, turned 70 acres of old pasture and timber into a gated subdivision called Silver Orchard Preserve, which was a funny name because the first thing he did was cut down nearly every orchard tree on the place, pears, walnuts, hickories, sycamores older than his daddy, all gone in a summer, ground into chips and hauled away like they had never mattered. Then came the stone entrance, the fake gas lanterns, the houses with 3-car garages and no shade, and the kind of landscaping that looks good on a brochure but gives up the minute weather gets personal. Claire became president of the Silver Orchard Homeowners Council the next year, and from the start, she decided my farm was not charming rural character. It was a visual nuisance. Her back deck faced my north windbreak, 4 staggered rows of cedar, bur oak, hackberry, and Osage orange that my father and I planted when I came home from graduate school in 1983. Those rows were not random. They were spaced for wind drag, snow capture, soil retention, and ice load. They slowed a west wind by more than half before it ever reached the houses behind them, though nobody in Silver Orchard knew that, and Claire Shaw was not about to put it in the newsletter. The first time she came to my porch, she had a folder under her arm and a smile so polished it looked like it had been purchased in a package with the subdivision gates. "Mr. Hale," she said. She was already disappointed in me. "We would like to discuss the tree barrier along your western line." I was drinking coffee with June. It was a Saturday morning in April, which is not a good time to interrupt a farmer unless something is on fire, bleeding or calving. I said, "Morning, Mrs. Whitcomb, what about it?" She opened the folder and pulled out a color printout of my trees, taken from her deck, with little red circles around the sections she disliked, which was apparently all of them. She said, "They create a very closed-off feeling for our residents." I said, "That is because they are a windbreak." She blinked once, like I had answered in a foreign language. She said, "Our council feels they are inconsistent with the aesthetic direction of Silver Orchard." I said, "Lucky for both of us, my trees do not belong to Silver Orchard." She laughed, not because anything was funny, but because people like Claire laugh when they want you to remember they are above being offended. Then she leaned closer and said, "Ben, may I call you Ben?" I said, "You may not." June coughed into her mug, and I knew right then I would be hearing about that line for the next 10 years. Claire pressed on anyway. She told me the trees were ugly. She told me they blocked sunset views. She told me Grant knew people on the county planning board. Then she said, "Maybe it is time you stop pretending this is 1931 and accepted that the area is changing. Now I have had cows step on my foot. I've had ice split fence posts clean in half. I have had college freshmen tell me pine trees and cedar trees are basically the same thing, so I am not an easy man to rattle." But something about that sentence sat down in my chest and took its boots off. I looked past her at those 4 rows of trees, At the Burr Oak, my father had watered from 5-gallon buckets during the drought of 1984. At the Cedars, my daughter Leela used to hide behind when she was little. At the Hedge, my grandfather would have understood without needing a brochure. And I said, "Mrs. Whitcomb, this farm was here before your gate, before your council, and before your husband learned to spell preserve. The trees stay." Her face did not change much. People like Claire do not lose control in public. They just make a note in their head and send the bill later. She slid the papers back into her folder and said, "Then I suppose we will have to take the appropriate steps." I told her she was welcome to take steps all the way back down the driveway. That was the beginning. After that came complaint letters, council motions, certified notices, social media posts, and one truly memorable newsletter column titled "Restoring Openness to Our Shared Landscape," which was Claire language for Ben Hale should cut down his trees because I do not like looking at them while I drink Chardonnay. She filed nuisance claims with the county, environmental concerns with the state, even a fire hazard report, which made the county forester laugh so hard over the phone that he had to apologize twice. Every claim died the same way, on paper, quietly, because my setbacks were legal. My land was agricultural. My conservation paperwork was current, and my trees were healthier than half the people complaining about them. But Claire was not really after the trees, not at first anyway. The trees were the parts she could point at. What she really hated was that my land would not behave like hers. It would not flatten itself, fence itself, join her council, pay dues, or ask permission. It sat there, 260 acres of family dirt and old wood, reminding Silver Orchard that not everything with value can be staged for a real estate photo. For a long time, I thought if I ignored her, she would get bored. That was my mistake. Claire Whitcomb did not get bored. Claire collected resentment the way some women collect antique plates. And by the winter, everything changed. She had a whole cabinet full of it, polished, labeled, and ready to throw. By the fall before the storm, Claire had stopped pretending this was about scenery, and Grant, her husband, finally came to my place himself, which told me more than any newsletter ever could. He rolled up my gravel drive in a black Lincoln Navigator that looked freshly washed even though every road within 5 miles was dust and clay, and he stepped out wearing a quilted vest, pressed jeans, and boat shoes, which always makes me nervous on a farm because a man who wears boat shoes away from water is usually about to say something expensive. I was mending a gate latch near the equipment shed when he walked over with both hands in his pockets and that developer smile on his face. The kind that says he has already spent the money he thinks you are about to accept. "Bennett," he said, like we had ever been on first-name terms. "I believe it is time we talked about the future." I said, "Grant, if the future involves you holding that gate while I tighten this bolt, I am listening." He did not laugh. That was the first sign he was not there for neighborly small talk. He told me his company was prepared to offer $3.4 million for the farm. All cash, quick close, no drama. And he said it in a voice soft enough to sound kind if you were not listening closely. I stood up slow, wiped grease on my jeans, and looked across the field at the old windbreak moving in the November air. That land had my father's sweat in it, my grandfather's failures in it, my daughter's childhood in it, my wife's patience in it, and Grant was talking about it like a tired couch he could haul off before lunch. I told him the farm was not for sale. He smiled again, but this time only half his mouth joined in. "Then, everything becomes for sale eventually." I said, "Not everything." Then his voice changed. He said the county was growing, taxes were shifting. Agricultural exemptions were not guaranteed forever, and a man my age ought to think carefully before standing in the way of progress. Now I have been threatened by men in neckties, men in muddy boots, and one church lady with a pie server, so I know the shape of a threat even when somebody wraps it in concern. I told him to get off my land. He looked at me a long second and said, "You are going to wish you had been more practical." I said, "Grant, I've been practical since I was 9 years old. Practical is why my trees are still standing." He drove away without spinning his tires because men like Grant even leave angry in a way that protects the paint. 20 minutes later, I called Marcus Bell, my attorney, who had represented my family since my mother sued a seed company in 1987 over a bad batch of black walnut stock. Marcus was 66, wore suspenders without irony, and had the patience of a courthouse clock. I told him what Grant said. He went quiet for a while, then said, "Ben, you need to come by tomorrow morning." I asked if something had changed. He said, "No, and that is the problem. Nothing has changed for too long. The next morning I drove into town and found Marcus waiting with coffee, a legal pad, and 3 cardboard file boxes stacked on his conference table. He tapped the top box and said, "I was hoping we would never need this." I said, "Need what?" He said, "Silver Orchard." The boxes held 10 years of complaints, county notes, builder records, tree removal permits that had never been properly filed, stormwater reports, council budgets, reserve statements, invoices, emails, shell company registrations, and the kind of paper trail that makes a calm room feel suddenly crowded. Marcus had been building the file quietly since Claire filed her first claim against my trees. He had seen what I had not wanted to see, that the Whitcombs were not just arrogant, they were sloppy. And sloppy people with power leave footprints everywhere. The worst of it was the neighborhood emergency fund. Silver Orchard residents had paid into it every quarter for years, supposedly for road repair, gate failure, storm cleanup, backup generators, and water system emergencies. According to the statements Claire sent homeowners, the fund had more than $800,000 in it. According to the bank records Marcus had found through a retired accountant on the council, the fund had been drained down to almost nothing through payments to a consulting company called Orchard View Management, which sounded respectable until Marcus showed me the registration papers. The company was owned by Grant's nephew, a 27-year-old in Branson whose main business experience appeared to be selling aftermarket truck lights online. I remember sitting there with my hands folded, feeling something old and tired turn into something sharp. Marcus said, "Ben, I know you do not like fights." I said, "That is not true. I like fights fine when they are necessary. I just do not like noise." He nodded and slid another folder across the table. There were photographs of the original timber Grant had cleared in 2012, GPS marked by the former county forester before he retired. 186 protected trees removed without mitigation, each carrying a penalty Grant had somehow avoided because the file got misplaced during a staffing change. Misplaced is a polite word. In my experience, papers only get lost when somebody benefits from nobody finding them. That afternoon, June made chicken stew and let me sit at the kitchen table with the file until the light went blue outside. She did not ask me what I was thinking, because after 44 years of marriage, she knows my thinking face from my tractor is broken face. Finally, she sat across from me and said, "Are we finally done being polite?" I said, "I believe we are." She smiled a little and said, "Good, because I have been polite since 2013 and it has given me indigestion." The first real break came from a woman named Ruthie Palmer, who lived in Silver Orchard in the smallest house on the smallest lot, which meant Claire treated her like a folding chair with a mortgage. Ruthie had been a school secretary for 30 years, and if you want to hide wrongdoing, do not do it anywhere near a retired school secretary, because those women can smell missing paperwork through drywall. Ruthie had kept copies of council minutes, dues notices, deleted online posts, budget handouts, and attendance sheets, all filed by date in plastic sleeves. She brought them to June in a grocery tote one rainy Thursday and said, "I do not want to hurt the neighborhood, but I'm tired of watching Claire call cruelty leadership." That sentence stayed with me. Cruelty leadership. I had seen it in faculty meetings, church committees, livestock auctions, and every HOA story ever told by a person with a twitch in one eye. Ruthie's records helped Marcus connect the money. My daughter, Nora, who'll become a federal prosecutor in Kansas City before switching to private practice after her second baby, came home for Thanksgiving and read the file in one sitting. Around midnight, she looked up from the dining table, rubbed her eyes, and said, "Dad, this is not just local fraud. They mailed false statements across state lines to absentee owners. They used electronic transfers. They represented the emergency fund in sales packets. That is wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and maybe bank fraud if they used the reserves for loan support." I said, "Honey, I was hoping you would tell me I was overreacting." She said, "Dad, you have underreacted so hard it should qualify as a medical condition." The criminal referral went out 2 weeks later to the State Attorney General's Real Estate Fraud Unit, and the investigator assigned to it was a woman named Denise Calder, who had grown up on a dairy farm and had no patience for polished people who stole from regular ones. She came to my farm in early January, walks the windbreak with me in a wool coat and mud boots, asked better questions than most forestry students I ever had, and at the end of the walk, she looked towards Silver Orchard and said, "Mr. Hale, cases like this usually need one thing the paperwork cannot provide." I asked what that was. She said, "A public moment nobody can spin." 3 days later, The weather gave her one. The first advisory came in on a Friday morning. Freezing rain, heavy ice load, wind gusts over 60 miles an hour, power outages expected, dangerous travel, prolonged cold. I read it twice at the kitchen table. Then called the propane company. The generator man, the county road supervisor, Marcus, Ruthie, and Sheriff Cal Watkins, who had known my family since my father pulled his patrol car out of a creek in 1976. I did not call Claire. She had spent 13 years telling people Silver Orchard was prepared for anything, and I had learned not to interrupt a woman while she was giving the universe a dare. By sundown Saturday, June and I had the old lambing barn swept, the wood stove checked, 40 cots unfolded, coffee stocked, soup ready, and a hand-painted sign taped to the door that said, "Hale Farm Warming Room, open to neighbors." Ruthie delivered quiet warning packets to the household she trusted, 37 of them, each packet explaining that the Silver Orchard Reserve Fund was gone, state investigators were involved, and if the power failed, our barn would be open. Some people believed her, some got angry, some read the page and went pale. That night the ice began, not dramatic at first, just a faint ticking on the porch rail, the kind of sound that makes country people stop mid-sentence. By midnight, the cedars were silver. By 3 in the morning, the power lines west of us were sagging like wet rope. At 4:12, the lights in Silver Orchard went out. At 5:30, the first ornamental pair split down the middle and punched through a garage roof on Marigold Lane. By sunrise, the subdivision Claire had called elegant and open looked like a wedding cake dropped down a staircase. Trees across driveways, fences peeled back, gutters hanging loose, no heat, no gate power, no working pumps in half the houses, and no emergency crew coming fast because the county roads were already a skating rink. Our windbreak was bent under ice, yes, but standing. Every row doing exactly what my father said it would do, if I ever had the sense to maintain it. June put coffee on. I opened the cattle gate, and at 7008 that morning, the first Silver Orchard family came walking up our drive, carrying 2 blankets, a diaper bag, and the stunned look of people who had just discovered that pretty is not the same thing as prepared. By 9 that morning, there were 12 people in the lambing barn, then 20, then 31, and June moved through them like she had been born with a coffee pot in one hand and a calm word in the other. She did not ask anybody who had signed Claire Whitcomb's petitions. She did not ask who had laughed at the Squirrel Museum joke. She just handed out soup, pointed children toward the warmest corner, and told grown men where to stack wet boots before they ruined her floor mats. That is the thing about June. She can make charity feel like discipline, and somehow people thank her for both. Ruthie stood by the stove taking names, not because we needed a guest list, but because she wanted to make sure every child, every elderly neighbor, every diabetic, every person on oxygen was accounted for. Around 10:30, Grant Whitcomb walked in through the barn door with his face gray from cold and pride fighting for space in his eyes. His navigator was stuck near the gatehouse. His phone was dead. His council office was locked behind an electric security system with no backup, and the man who had offered to buy my farm like it was an outdated appliance now needed a place to charge his phone and thaw his hands. I said, "Morning, Grant." He looked around at the cots, the coffee, the wood stove, the Silver Orchard resident sitting under my roof, and for once he did not have a speech ready. He said, "Ben, I need to make some calls." I pointed at the power strip on the folding table and said, "Same as everybody else." He stared at me like he wanted to object to being categorized with everybody else, but cold has a way of trimming a man's vocabulary. He plugged in his phone and sat near the back wall, away from Ruthie, away from the families, away from the older couple whose dues he had helped steal for almost 10 years. Then, a little after 1 in the afternoon, Claire arrived. I saw her white Range Rover before I saw her, sliding sideways a little on the ice, stopping crooked outside my cattle gate. She stepped out in a cream-colored coat, black leggings, and one of those expensive knit hats with a little fake fur ball on top. Though the overall effect was less Aspen vacation and more frightened woman pretending not to be. One of her boots had split at the seam. Her makeup had run under one eye. She looked at the barn, then at the line of muddy footprints leading inside, then at me. Behind me, Sheriff Cal Watkins leaned against my old Dodge with a cup of June's coffee, looking like a man who had decided the day was about to become interesting. Claire lifted her chin and said, "Mr. Hale, my house has taken damage. There is a tree through the breakfast room." The council emergency line is not responding, and I cannot reach my husband. I said, Grant's inside. She blinked. I said, he got here around 10:30. Hess warming up. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in 13 years, I saw Claire Whitcomb without a prepared expression. She said, my son. I said, Evan came in with the McAllister family before breakfast. Ooh's fine. June gave him dry socks. That did something to her. Not enough to change who she was, maybe, but enough to crack the glass. Her eyes filled, and she turned her face away like tears were another kind of bad publicity. Then she said, the council has emergency funds. We can reimburse whatever expense this is creating. Sheriff Watkins looked down into his coffee. I looked at Claire and felt the strangest calm of my life. I said, Claire, there is no emergency fund. Orchard View management drained it through consulting invoices, maintenance studies, storm readiness reviews, and half a dozen other names for stealing from your own neighbors. The Attorney General has the records, Marcus has the records, Ruthie has the minutes, and Grant has been sitting in my barn for 3 hours trying to reach a lawyer who already knows the warrants are coming. Her face went still, not innocent still, not guilty still, just the stillness of a person calculating which door might still be open. She whispered, you have no idea what you are talking about. I said, maybe, but the woman driving up the road right now does. A black state SUV rolled slowly through the ice toward the gate, followed by 2 county trucks. Claire turned and watched it come, and I swear, all those years of polished smiles and council gavels and neighborhood authority just drained out of her shoulders. Denise Calder stepped out wearing a dark coat, boots, and the expression of somebody who had spent a career waiting for people like the Whitcombs to run out of weather. She nodded to Sheriff Watkins, then to me, then walked past Claire into the barn. I followed because it was my barn, because those were my neighbors whether they knew it or not, and because there are some moments in life you do not watch from a window. The room went quiet when Denise entered. Even the children seemed to feel the air change. Grant stood up halfway, saw the badge, and sat back down like his knees had received different instructions from his brain. Denise stopped in front of him and said, Grant Whitcomb. I'm Special Investigator Denise Calder with the Missouri Attorney General's office. You are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, theft from a homeowners association, false financial reporting, and unlawful removal of protected timber. He looked at Claire standing near the door behind her. She looked back at him, and there was more marriage in that one ruined glance than I had seen between them in all the years before. Not love exactly, but shared panic, shared blame, shared knowledge. The cuffs clicked at 1:37. Then Denise turned. Claire Whitcomb, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, embezzlement, false statements to homeowners, and obstruction related to the Silver Orchard Council investigation. Claire did not scream. I almost wish she had. Screaming would have made her seem smaller, maybe even human. Instead, she looked straight at me and said, Are you happy now, Mr. Hale? And I told her the truth. I said, No, Claire. Happy is not the word for watching a whole neighborhood learn. It was robbed in the middle of an ice storm. But I am relieved. There is a difference. They walked the Whitcombs out past the cots, past the soup table, past the children warming their hands around the stove, past Ruthie Palmer, who did not smile, did not gloat, did not say, I told you so. She just wrote the time in her notebook, because that is what secretaries do when history finally admits it needs a witness. Silver Orchard got power back 4 days later. Some people thanked us before they left. Some could barely look at me. A few still acted like the real tragedy was that all of this had happened publicly, which tells you plenty about why people like Claire get power in the first place. The indictments came in February. Grant pleaded guilty by summer and got 8 years, plus restitution that wiped out most of what he had hidden. Claire took a deal for 5 years. And I heard later she told the judge she had only wanted to protect the character of the neighborhood. Ruthie, who was sitting 3 rows back, said just loud enough for half the courtroom to hear. Well, character has receipts now. The homeowners voted out the old council. They elected Ruthie president by a margin so wide it felt less like an election and more like a neighborhood exorcism. And her first official act was to repeal every rule Claire had used to make preparedness look ugly. Wood piles became legal. Backup generators became legal. Rain barrels, storm shutters, working gardens, all legal. Then Silver Orchard did something I never expected. They asked me to help them plant trees. Not decorative trees, not brochure trees, real ones, staggered rows along the western and southern lines. Cedar, bur oak, hackberry, osage orange. 186 seedlings for the protected trees Grant had cut down, plus 50 more because Ruthie said interest should apply to nature too. I donated the seedlings. The residents dug the holes. June made sandwiches. My grandson Milo labeled each row with popsicle sticks, and Claire Whitcomb's son Evan, 16 years old and quieter than any boy should have to be, worked beside me all afternoon without saying much. Near dusk he looked at the first row and said, "How long before they work?" I said, "Depends what you mean by work." He said, "Before they stop the wind." I looked at that boy, at the mud on his shoes, at the subdivision behind him, at the little trees in the ground. I said, "Some things start working the day you decide they are worth waiting for." He nodded like he wanted to remember that without admitting he needed it. A year after the storm, I walked the windbreak at sunrise with June, Milo, and our old dog, Biscuit, who has never protected anything in his life except the couch. The ice scars were still visible on a few branches, but the rows stood strong, old and stubborn and useful. Across the fence, the new silver orchard seedlings were no taller than a child, just thin sticks against the morning, but they were there. That mattered. Claire used to say my trees close off the neighborhood. Maybe she was right in a way. They closed off the wind. They closed off the cold. They closed off Grant Whitcomb's plan to turn my farm into another gated street with fake lanterns and no shade. But they also opened something, a barn door, a county file, a courtroom, maybe even a few mines. So here is what I still wrestle with, and I want you to tell me what you think. Was I wrong to wait until the storm made the truth impossible to ignore? Should I have exposed them sooner, before people got hurt, before roofs collapsed, before children had to walk through ice to my barn? Or was the storm the only thing powerful enough to make a proud community finally look at what pride had cost them? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I've lived with that question every morning since. And if you have ever had a neighbor, an HOA, a boss, or some polished little tyrant mock the slow work that keeps people safe, tell your story too. Sometimes justice wears a robe, sometimes it wears muddy boots, and sometimes it stands quietly in an ice storm, rooted deeper than anybody bothered to notice.